Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today I'm going to focus on leveraging Photoshop's image editing tools. You might call it retouching, just cleaning up problems in astro images, although the techniques I'm going to be using would apply to anything. So let's jump into Photoshop. So actually, before we jump into Photoshop, we're going to be looking at how to clean up images. And this is just a good example of an image. Uh, Looks okay with all the stars and everything, but when we create a starless image, do star reduction and so forth, you really start to see some of the artifacts that were generated. Some was glare, some was reflection from filters, just a whole host of issues. But you can clean it up so that it looks a whole lot better. And of course, one of the challenges is differentiating between what are processing artifacts and what are true structures out in space. So there's a set of retouching tools in Photoshop, and we're going to talk about really 4 of them, then there's kind of a 5th technique. From most useful to the ones you should avoid listed here. Most useful is just simple burning and dodging, and that's something that I think most people don't do, but it's really the most valuable, the most flexible, and has a lot of big advantages. The remove tool for me is number 2. It's newer in the last couple of years in Photoshop, so if you're using an older version of Photoshop, you may not have it accessible, in which case you would probably use some combination of the healing brush or the spot healing brush. The healing brush works kind of like the clone stamp tool, if you're familiar with that, with the difference being that it does some magic to blend the textures and colors, where the clone stamp is really a pretty blunt tool. And that's generally the last option that you would choose. There are a few instances where you have to use the clone stamp tool. Generally, they're very small, minor areas, and I would say avoid it. If you can use anything other than the clone stamp tool, use those first. So burning and dodging has the advantage of being extremely versatile, and it's 100% non-destructive. It doesn't add anything, it doesn't take away anything, it doesn't move stars around or obliterate structures or wipe out distant galaxies. It's completely non-destructive as long as you use it with some amount of caution. And that's what really makes it the most useful and probably the first option for any retouching. For smaller areas, the remove tool works very well if you have what I would call non-critical structure areas. It also works real well for removing things like satellite trails or airplane trails, where you need to do something, and it does a good job of filling in what it removes so that it makes sense in the context of what's around it. So it does create new texture, and that is something to be aware of. If you're absolutely opposed to creating any new texture, then you don't want to use any of the tools other than burn and dodge. Next in line would be the healing brush. Like I said, it works kind of like the clone stamp in terms of the user interface, but it's much more intelligent in how it blends the area that you're copying into the target area. All of these can be applied non-destructively, but like the remove tool, it is duplicating an existing texture and copying it over. Almost all of these need to be done on starless layers so that you're not adding stars or taking away stars. Again, with the exception of burn and dodge. You can use burn and dodge on a layer that has stars, and we'll see that in the examples. And then last is the clone stamp. It just does a simple copy of the area to be repaired. And yes, you can apply it non-destructively on its own layer, but it does duplicate existing texture. And generally, it's going to be the most obvious, the one that people are most likely to see, something was done to this, and it looks odd. So avoid it whenever you can. The last one we're going to talk about is creating a black background replacement. And I use this in basically every image. If we look at this as an example, the background has a lot of stuff, but there's really nothing there. I mean, there's stars and galaxies and so forth, but the background doesn't have filter reflections and glow from high clouds, so it should be just a smooth, dark background. So what we'll do is darken the background so that it's basically black. And you can see the black border blends right into where the black background begins. And then we're going to add a layer that will lighten anything darker than a certain very dark value. It will lighten it up to that minimum dark value. So it'll wind up looking like this with a very smooth, uniform background that just kind of magically eliminates all of those problems without having to work on them one by one. Not all images are going to lend themselves this readily to this techniques, but I do, like I say, I do use it on basically every image I work on. So with that, let's jump into Photoshop. And the first example I want to work with is this one, and this is actually a portion of a mosaic. And the main thing I want to focus on here are these filter reflections. And this is captured with an Optilong L-Enhance filter, and it's the least effective of the Optilong dual narrowband line. And it does create some pretty nasty reflections around bright stars. But you can see over in the layers palette, we have our starless layer and then we have our stars. If I turn off the stars, you can see that by and large, those filter reflections are on the starless layer. So to fix those, I'm going to come down to the starless layer and I want to use the remove tool. And the remove tool is in the group of healing tools. If you click and hold, you'll get a fly-out menu with different options: spot healing brush, remove tool, healing brush. And the one we're going to use here is the remove tool. And this is a brush-based tool, so you can use the left and right bracket keys to make the brush bigger or smaller. And you want it to be, a little bit bigger than the area that you want to heal or remove. But we want to do this non-destructively. I don't want to actually change this layer because I may decide I've made a mistake or I want to come back and do something different. So we're going to do it on a separate layer. So I'm just going to use the Add New Layer icon at the bottom of the Layers palette, and that added a blank layer. And we're going to leave it in normal blending mode. And then on the Remove Tool options bar, I want to make sure I have clicked Sample All Layers, and I want to unclick Remove After Each Stroke. And what that lets me do is apply multiple strokes or correction areas and then work on them all at once. So I'll just move over the areas I want to correct, click, and you can see it leaves a little pink area. And I'm just going to go around to the areas where we have these filter reflections, and I'm going to select those to be repaired. So that looks like that's all of them, or at least the majority of them. So now I'll just click the check mark, or I could press enter, and that tells Photoshop to go through and apply these corrections. And because we've chosen Sample All Layers, it's going to put the corrections on this blank layer, but it's going to consider both what's on the blank layer as well as what's below it. Now, because it's sampling all layers, it also samples what's above. So you do want to make sure that there are no other layers above this currently turned on. And now if we zoom in, we can turn this layer off and on. And you can see it's done a pretty good job of blending the surrounding texture to make those filter reflections go away. So let's turn the stars on, and we see that there's actually another filter reflection here. So if I turn the star layer off and on, you can see, well, that's actually on the star layer. Now, if I use the remove tool here, it'll remove that reflection from the star layer, but it'll also remove any of the stars that are in that area, and we don't want to do that. So I'm going to do something different here. I'm going to use the burn and dodge tool on the stars layer. And remember I said you could use it because it's non-destructive. So first I'm going to add a blank layer, and now I'm adding it above the stars layer in that stars layer group. And I'm going to go to my brush tool by tapping B on the keyboard. If I tap the D key, that'll give me my default colors of black and white. And I can switch back and forth between black and white by just tapping the X key. And I want to use a fairly low opacity. I'll start with 10%. Occasionally you'll use more than that. More often you'll use 5% or 2% or something. So I want to just start by darkening this area, because as you can see there are stars in here and very right adjacent to that, and there's certainly a star in the center, and it looks like there may even be a couple stars in there. And we don't want to lose those stars, we just want to darken this reflection so that it blends in. So by painting with black on this layer in soft light blending mode, that will darken the area but not change anything. It's just making it darker. So I'm just going to go around here. I'm just clicking and painting, and it's building up a little bit at a time. And usually you're better off to build it up slowly. You can make the brush smaller. And each time I click, because I have 10% opacity, it's laying down another 10% density of that brush. And I'm just gradually darkening anything that is too bright because of that filter reflection. Some areas need a little bit more to blend in. And you'll find sometimes you need to add a second layer or a layer in overlay mode because soft light isn't a real powerful burning and dodging layer. Overlay is more powerful but a little harder to control. But let's turn this healing layer off and on, and you can see what a difference it made. And these little stars, all those little details are still there. We haven't changed anything. All we've done is darken that reflection so that it's no longer an issue. Now, if I need to darken it a little bit more, and I've gone as far as I can with this layer, I would simply add a second blank layer, put it again in soft light blending mode, and then continue painting with black to darken it a little bit more. And that's all there is to it. So we've used the healing brush on a blank layer in the starless layer. Let's turn off the stars to remove those filter reflections. And then we've used a burning and dodging technique on the stars group to remove that reflection around this star. So that's a simple approach using the remove tool and beginning to look at using burning and dodging. Let's look at the Iris Nebula. This isn't a whole lot of data. This is just a couple hours, but there's a number of opportunities here to use burning and dodging. First of all, we've got a little bit of a glare from a bright star just outside of the field of view, so we can see it creating rays coming in here. Looks like there's a filter reflection here, a bright reflection here, maybe a little bit of a dust mote right there. So we're going to repair all of this starting with burning and dodging. So again, I'm going to add a blank layer, put it in soft light blending mode, go to my brush at 10% opacity. I'll make the brush a little bigger. Let's deal with these streaks first and make the brush a little smaller. If you go too far, just tap the X key to make white the foreground color. We need to go to 5% opacity, which I can get to by just tapping 0.5 on the keyboard. And a good technique to see how you're doing is just to turn that layer off and on to make sure that you have done an appropriate amount and not gone too far. Let's deal with these larger reflections here. I'm going to go back to 10% opacity by tapping the 1 key. And these reflections are usually pretty easy to deal with. They're usually big and round, so you can paint with a fairly large brush. And it's just a matter of blending those reflections into the background. And again, we're not trying to create any new texture. We don't want to erase or add any galaxies in here. We've got what might be a little bit of a dust mode here, so I'm going to switch to white, make the brush smaller, and just go in a circle to correct that. And we've got some more like filter reflections down here. This looks like maybe another dust mote. So using a combination of both white and black to blend that in. 5%. And you can spend as long as you want or as short a time as you want working on these issues. This is really where a lot of the creativity lies. And of course, if you're burning and dodging, there's nothing that says you can't burn and dodge creatively to extend the dynamic range of an image. So for instance, the center here is pretty bright. If I do some burning and dodging around it, I can darken this hot spot in the center, make the darks a little darker to give it a little bit more contrast. And if we just turn that area off and on, or that layer, you can see the difference it makes. And now when I turn the stars on, we have a much better looking image than without that. So here we did primarily burning and dodging. Let's go to the third example. This is some data of the Andromeda Galaxy that a friend of mine shared with me, and he observed that he needs to clean his sensor, which I agree with, and then probably shoot new flats so that your flats and your sensor cleanliness are kind of in sync. And particularly when we remove the stars layer, you can see that there's a lot of dust in here. So we'll start by cleaning up the dust. And again, these are all situations where it's too dark. We don't want to change the underlying structure, especially in here. There's a lot of galaxy structure. We just want to blend in these dark areas so that it looks more natural. So I'm going to come down into the RGB layer, add a blank layer, put it in soft light blending mode, and with my brush, I'll start with 10% opacity by tapping the 1 key. And here we want to paint with white to blend in these areas, just like so. And like I said, if you go too far, you can just switch from black to white or white to black. And what you're trying to do is just make it uniform. And sometimes it takes a little bit of iteration, and sometimes you do have to go to a lower opacity brush. This area has not only a brightness, but also a little bit of a color issue. So we're going to use a similar technique to burning and dodging. We're going to add another blank layer. And just so we don't get confused, let's label this first one Burn and Dodge. And I'm going to add a second blank layer. And where the first one was in soft light blending mode, we're going to put this one in color blending mode. But it's still a blank layer. With my brush tool, I want to sample the neighboring color here. So I can hold the alternate key down and the brush turns into an eyedropper, and I can sample this color. And usually something like 30 or 40% opacity. And I'll just paint over that on the color layer. So we're not changing brightness, we're only changing color, and that does make it a little bit easier to see what we need to do for density. So go back to a white and blend these in. something maybe like that. We've got a similar issue, I think, up here. There, this needs to be blended in. So doing these areas that are what I would call inside or right on the edges of the galaxy are the most important to spend time on. We've got a little bit down here. This is still kind of image area, so we want to try to blend it in a little bit. Some of these big areas are really outside of what's going to be an image area because we're going to use the background replacement technique, and that will solve a lot of these issues. And again, if we turn this layer on and off just to see what we've done. Maybe add a little bit of brightness here. Brightness here, I think. So let's deal with this background. I'm going to come above my burn and dodge and my color layer. Generally, you want any pixel-bearing layers, and these are pixel-bearing layers, to be below adjustment layers. So I'm going to add a levels adjustment layer, and we'll darken the darks. And that does a pretty good job of darkening the background. Some areas it goes all the way to black. So now let's use the layer that's going to lighten everything up to a minimum black level. And to do that, I'm going to add a solid color layer. Again, this is an adjustment layer, and I want RGB values. I normally use 19, 19, 19. And an easy way to get 19, 19, 19 is to type 13, 13, 13 into this hex field. The little hash mark indicates that these are hexadecimal values. And by default, when you open the solid color picker, that is the field that's already highlighted. So you just open it up, type 13, 13, 13, and there is our very dark but not black background layer. And we'll just make this lighten blending mode instead of normal. So anything that was darker than an RGB values of 13, 13, 13 get lightened up to 13, 13, 13. And you can see that combination of darkening the background and then adding this 19 layer solved almost all of those issues. There's still some junk around the edges. So we'll fine-tune this with another burning and dodging layer. And I don't want to use this first one because that one's got fairly detailed burning and dodging. So I'm just going to add another blank layer, soft light blending mode, and grab my brush tool. Black is my foreground, 10% opacity, and I'm just going to go around starting in these corners and just darken the areas that I think should be fading into black. If it's gone too far in some areas, we can paint with white and bring back some of that glow. And let's say something like this. Turn the stars on, and there's a much better image than what we started with. And we didn't have to use the clone stamp tool. We didn't have to use a remove tool. It was all cleaned up just with burning and dodging. It looks like there may be a little bit of color issue in some areas, and that again can be fixed on the color layer if you need to go in and adjust that. So the last one to look at is this image of the Shrimp Nebula, and if we look at it, it's got somewhat the same issue. There's a lot of just junk in this background that doesn't add anything to the image. And we can do the same thing that we did with the earlier one. So here's our RGB layer. Here's our levels adjustment I'll start by adding a levels adjustment to darken this background, being careful to kind of keep an eye on the data. And then I'm going to add the 1313 or 191919 layer. And we still have a lot of junk in the background. Let me turn off the stars. And you can see that there's just, most of it is just junk. There's a few galaxies here and there. Most of it is just junk. So let's add a levels adjustment layer. And I'm going to add it below the, a blank layer. Again, soft light blending mode. And 10% opacity. And we're just going to use a big brush, and every time I click, you can see it's darkening those areas to the point that it blends in with that solid background. And I can just go around and paint in these areas. And again, any place where there's galaxies, we may have made them a bit darker, but we're not eliminating them. So we're not changing any of the data in the image. All we're doing is cleaning up a lot of this junk. And I think we're going to reach a point here again where we've gone as far as we can with a soft light layer, because it, unless something is already fairly dark, it won't drive it all the way to black. Even if I go to 100% opacity, it doesn't quite take out everything, so we'll add another soft light layer. And actually in this case we could just make this a blank layer and just paint it black and be done with it. There were no galaxies visible in that filter reflection. And now when we turn the stars on, now we have that nice uniform background, very easily, very quick. They're not always this easy. Certainly they're not always this bad. This one needed a lot of work, and that turns it into it's not going to be an award-winning image, but it was a good example of how to use this technique. If I had a satellite trail through here, which I don't, but if I did, I would do that again down on the starless layer. And let's turn off the stars. And let's just pretend that we had a satellite trail going across. What I would do, just like I did before, I would add a blank layer, use the remove tool, and because I have other layers above it, I need to turn these off temporarily. And then I would usually, let's say the satellite trail went across here. I would use the brush or the remove tool, and as long as you have selected or not selected remove after each stroke, that lets you click multiple times. And you can also click, and that puts down a spot. And then you can go at the other end of a straight line, hold the shift key down, and click again, and it'll draw a straight line connecting those two spots. So if I just drew that along a satellite trail and then press enter or click the check mark, then it will go through and remove that satellite trail, then turn the other layers back on, and you're back to a finished image. So hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments down below. And as always, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.